Hi, we're going to try something new this week. It's something that elementary kids know very well. It's called doing it off the cuff with little preparation. I had some theories that I wanted to share with you earlier this week. The one is the warp drive, what real physicists are working on in terms of developing a warp drive technology like in Star Trek that can go faster than light. And I wanted to talk about the origins of Christianity and something about a part of the Bible in Judaism. And that's about it. Earlier this week, I was talking with a classmate. He just popped up out of the blue, and this is a classmate I hadn't really been talking with since early elementary school. And he suggested something that rather than spend time putting together an episode all about one topic and doing research, I should just continue talking. Just do a video where I just talk about my thoughts, what's on my mind. It sounds very random, but I'll give it a try. Certainly is less effort. I don't want to say less effort. Less time consuming. He also wanted to interview me. I hope that comes about. But it's strange that when I'm at work, like for example, earlier today, the internet was down nationwide, and we had to find something else to do. So I took a sheet of paper and I wrote down. Well, actually, before that, I was talking with a coworker, and I mentioned the Secret Service code names for the presidents, and I just reeled them off. And I went over to my seat and I thought, wow, I'm going to really impress this coworker. So I took a sheet of paper, and my job entails taking calls. So I had enough meticular fortitude. I had enough strong mentality to be able to take a break from what I was writing and then answer the call and then go back to what I was writing. Sometimes jot down more information while I was talking. Anyway, I listed the presidents from Truman to Biden with their Secret Service code names, and in some cases, I know the Secret Service code name of the other family members. Now, I figured this would impress her, and it did. And I showed it to another coworker, and hopefully that would come to something. I just like when people notice how well informed I am, how smart I am, and so forth. So I listed them and I showed it to her. And then afterwards, I thought, gee, I'm going to do something even better. Oh, they were remarking on, gee, you did this off the top of your head? Like you just did this from memory? Yeah. So as another sheet, I wrote down the presidential campaigns, starting, of course, with the most recent because it's easier to go backwards, in my case anyway. So I started with the 2020 campaign, who was the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate for each party, and then just worked my way backwards, mentioning, of course, the years and so forth. For the other one, too, I mentioned the years for each president when they were in office. And then I started, let me see, I think that was it. I mentioned Camp David and so forth. And so I had been doing something else yesterday, and I think the day before, I was making notes in my little iPhone I have here that I take to work with me. I was making notes on the Roman history, particularly the Flavian dynasty and the dynasty before that, which was the the Julio-Nero dynasty. Now, why are those so important to me? Well, I find those fascinating because of a certain theory by Joseph Atwell called Caesar's Messiah. He wrote a book called that name, and there have been documentaries since then. In fact, that's how I found out about it. It was from a documentary I had seen streaming on television. So, what's the premise of this theory? It's that the Christian Bible was rather than okay, let me rephrase that. Okay, so the popular conception of the origins of Christianity is that there was a Jesus Christ who was born and taught and so forth, and then he was like martyred essentially, and then the early followers of him then experienced persecution by the Romans because it wasn't the Roman religion, it was this new religion, and da 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 da. And then, of course, it spread. That's the popular conception. Okay, Caesar's Messiah, of course, I have to preface this by saying that I'm Jewish. So take that into context. But from what I've read, my understanding, it seems to fit better with what happened with the writings. And it seems at least Joseph Atwell and those proponents of his make a good case. And it seems to fit in, it seems to jibe with other information that I had read about this topic. All right. He proposes that I could mention a timeline there, but I'll go to it in a moment. But the Romans were, the Julio-Nero dynasty had ended with, obviously, Emperor Nero, and there was an uprising against Nero, and he was declared a public enemy by the Senate, and then he commits suicide, and then his general Vespasian, meanwhile, had been in Jerusalem trying to get into and invade Jerusalem and the Second Temple of the Jews. And when Nero dies, there was a year of the four emperors. That was 68 CE. CE standing for Common Era. Other people use Anno Domini, but that translates as the year of our Lord, and Jews would not say our Lord because Jesus has nothing to do with Judaism. All right, so, and other cultures that are not Christian don't have any relationship to our Lord, so they wouldn't use AD, they would use CE. All right, so in 68 of the Common Era, or 69, there was a year of the four emperors after Nero, and then Vespasian comes in and declares himself the new emperor and leaves his son in Jerusalem to go invade the Second Temple, destroy it, it's gone, blah, 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 blah. And so in the middle of that period, there were Jewish zealots, Sicarii, who may be considered terrorists. They were trying to get rid of Roman occupation and have their own autonomy. And the Romans, as I've read, were okay, or at least they were characterized as being okay with other religions and other cultures. However, you must pay obedience, or you must recognize the emperor as divine, and Jews would not do that. So the Jews became basically a thorn in the side of the Romans. So there was an event called, there was an event at Masada, which is a geographic area. I just imagine a mountain top. I don't remember if there was a mountain. I just imagine a mountaintop. Josephus, or Joseph ben Matityahu, um, and I think like 12 other Jews, something like that, which is oddly 13 or 12, which is maybe a symbolic number. But anyway, they gathered together and they figured, okay, we're going to commit suicide rather than be defeated and killed by the Romans. The Romans are coming. They're gonna storm us. Let's commit suicide instead. So they gathered into a circle, and each one killed the one next to him, and then they killed the one next to them, and so forth. And then the Romans come in, led by Vespasian, and he discovers Yosef ben Matityahu, and Yosef does something that many probably would do, which is say, "Oh, um, the great Roman general. I believe in the Roman way." I'm paraphrasing. Basically, he said he declared allegiance to Rome, something like that. So he got into Vespasian's good graces. He was taken back to Rome. Good strategy there, if you want to save your own life. So then he was adopted into this new Flavian dynasty of Vespasian. Flavius is a family name, as I understand it. And that's how he became Flavius Josephus. And so he became this well-regarded, in history has regarded him as a very useful historian to rely on for information, historical information about the period. Well, as I read more about this, I'm recognizing he has a certain bias, partly perhaps because he had to play up the Roman side. He had to become like a spokesman for the Romans. So at some point he recognizes, those prophecies that are spoken about the Messiah in our Jewish Bible. Well, I recognize Vespasian as the new Messiah. They clearly point to Vespasian. Well, of course, Vespasian really enjoyed that, and so they played that up in terms of Roman propaganda. And he and several others, this is what Joseph Atwell is proposing, he and several others write these Gospels, and the storyline that there was a character, Jesus, who was a prophet, who was saying that there would be this new Messiah. Now, I should mention that in Judaism, the word Messiah is actually Mashiach. It comes from the verb mashach, which means anoint, and that refers to the dumping of one's oil ceremonially to be recognized that the person now holds a certain seat or holds a certain title or position. For example, to enter the priesthood, to officially become a priest, you could have oil dumped upon your head, and that would be a Mashiach too. Just a Mashiach to be a priest. Or in modern times, you'd have the president swearing an oath, putting his hand on the Bible. That's a ceremonial act. It recognizes visually that you are now taking the oath. Okay. So these Gospels are written, and and Paul, or whoever became known as Paul, writes these letters propagandizing to various countries. And in my reading, there is some idea, there's some proposal, there are at least two books I came across the titles of, that propose that Paul was actually a closet homosexual, and that could explain his antagonism towards romantic relationships. Now, I'll have to read more into this, but this is my understanding, again, as a Jew who is not as well versed as a Christian would be in the texts. But the ones proposing this idea that he was a closeted homosexual expressed the idea that, or pointed to his feeling of uneasiness or his expressions about women in relationships with women and so forth. And that could be a case. There could be a case for it. Okay, so going back to Joseph Atwell, which is totally different. They're very different proposals. Okay, going back to Joseph Atwell, his proposal. So you have this propaganda being put out, and that Titus is actually the new Messiah, and you have references to, or your phrases that were Roman phrases that were used in Roman times with Vespasian and so forth, Pax Romana, peace on earth, so forth, that you also see in Christianity, in the Christian texts. And certain symbols, like, for example, the dolphin or the anchor or the fish, and the phrase fisher of men and so forth. They were used by the Flavians, and it could be no wonder then that later on in Christian texts they would be used and associated with Christianity. That's also interesting. I'm not sure if Joseph Atwell mentions this, but in the documentary I had seen called, I think it's Creating Christianity, something like that, they delve into the symbolism as well. That it wasn't originally the cross, that came later, that it was originally a dolphin or an anchor, a hook. It was a hook or a dolphin. The dolphin also being a type of fish. I know I know in modern times we understand it's a mammal, but the dolphin being a kind of fish. So you get the phrase fisher of men, so forth. So that was used actually by Apollo in ancient Greece. And at this time, they were trying to unify all the different cultures or influences that Rome had on Egypt and Greece and, of course, Rome. You had the Alexanders, the Herodians, and these are the families: Alexanders, the Herodians, and the Flavians. And the the Flavians were in Rome. That was the Roman dynasty at the time. The Alexanders were in Egypt, if I remember correctly. And what was the other one? The Herodians were the dynasty in the Second Temple in Jerusalem, amongst the Jews. Now, from what I remember, Herod was like a puppet, essentially a puppet governor for the Jews, for Israel. And there was resentment towards the Herods because they were not actual Jews governing themselves. This was not a Jewish dynasty governing the Second Temple and so forth. So these three families intertwine. It's interesting, the character of Berenice, who may have been Veronica in Christian culture. It's fascinating. So it served the Romans very well to create this propaganda that, oh, look, I should also mention the timeline. Oh, look, these texts, which might have been written around 70 CE, are talking about this figure called Jesus who came along and was a different kind of Messiah rather than the typical Jewish concept of a Messiah who would push against the Roman occupation and drive them out. It was more militaristic. This Jesus was proposing turn the other cheek, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and so forth. And if you read into it with um, that context or that perception, that point of view, you will notice, hey, this does seem to jibe, or there is weight to this idea, this theory. So it was basically backdated. They were written maybe 70 CE, but they're talking about events and people who lived about 30 or 40 years prior. But of course, it's not like you can't tell that it was backdated. These scriptures were passed out, passed along, and spread around and shared, and they were supposedly set in this earlier time period. So that's a little bit of an element of propaganda. All right. So, the concept of the Christians. This is an interesting twist. You've heard about Christians being persecuted. Well, either in the book directly or at least in the documentary I had seen. I think it's called "Creating the Christ," something like that. Of course, you may know that Christ is the Greek Christos, which is where you get Christ from. Christos is the Greek version of Mashiach, which means anointed one. Now, if you shift Christos back to Mashiach, you get, instead of Christians, you get a group in Rome who were the followers of the Mashiach, or Mashiachim, sort of, these Messiah people. That sounds very much like a segment of the Jewish population that was pushing for a Messiah to come to drive out the Romans. And in that context, you see the Romans persecuting this group of people within the Jewish population who were trying to push them out. And so instead of the Romans being the persecutors of this new religion, the Christians, because at that time it was basically Jesus and his followers. They wouldn't necessarily have been called the Christians that early. If you shift the word Christian or Christos back to the Messiah followers, you get something like that. You would also get something like what's written about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that, I think, that holds water. Rather than being the new Christian movement, this is really a movement that had already been there. These were more zealous, more militaristic segments of the Jewish population that just wanted to get rid of the Romans. So ironically, it's not the Christians, it's actually the Jews that they were persecuting. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that. And I also wanted to talk about this thing within the Jewish Bible itself. Now, I'm talking about Genesis specifically. You have 10 characters, each character being a different generation, because you start off with Adam and then he has a son. Well, actually, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Jewish God, animates a being of clay, and the name is Adam. So then Adam begets Seth in his likeness, and then Seth begets Enos, and Enos begets, and each one begets the next the member of the next generation. So you get 10, and then during the 10th generation, that's Noah, and that's when the flood occurs, and then and then he has 3 sons. Meanwhile, the flood when he's 500 years old, he has 3 sons, and then 100 years later, in Noah's 600th life, yes, these people lived extremely long lifespans, and that's what I'm getting to. For those of you who are wondering where I'm going with this, in the 600th year of Noah's life, the flood waters come, and then they flood the whole area. They flood the world. And then the floodwaters recede, and then you have the three sons of Noah step out and then essentially repopulate the world as they knew it. Shem begets the Shemites, and which are essentially that Jewish Middle Eastern area, and the Shem, Yefet, or Japheth in the Greek transliteration of it. I'm more familiar with the original Hebrew, but you have Shem, which oddly means name, and Japheth or Yefet, and Ham, Ham, and he begets the Hamites, and from his lineage, very soon you have the Egyptians. You have Mitzrayim, who are the Egyptians. So that's the spread of population. So, all right. So in this lineage, you have Noah, which is the 10th, counting Adam as 1. You have Noah as 10, and then 11 is Shem, and then you have 9 more. Well, no, 8 more. You have 9 more after Noah, and then you have the 3 patriarchs. I believe he's number 21, something like that. You have Abram, who will then encounter Elohim. That's a whole other thing. In the Jewish Bible, well, actually, in the Bible that you've seen, you probably noticed that sometimes the deity is referred to as God, sometimes the deity is referred to as the Lord. When it says the Lord, actually in the Hebrew, in most cases, it says Yud, He, Vav, He. Those are the 4 Hebrew letters. And I suspect, from the texts that we have where the scribe did, for whatever reason, write in the vowels. Right, let me explain that. In a modern scroll that you'd see in a temple, you won't see any of the vowels. They're simply the consonants written out. But when it's written with the vowels, traditionally the vowels for Yud, He, Vav, He are left out. They are not written. However, in many, many texts, as Nehemiah Gordon has identified, there are texts where you do see the vowels in there. And there's a mnemonic device to help you remember. This is in a letter from one rabbi to another. There's a whole ritual, and I forget the rabbi's name, but Nehemiah Gordon identified this letter, or a reference to this, reference this letter. There's a ritual where one rabbi passes along the vowels and the pronunciation of the name to the next rabbi while standing in water. And that has symbolic meaning. I think it's something like the name goes over like the wind over the water, something like that, rush of the water, something like that. So the vowels are the same vowels that you see in the word for heaven. Anyway, it's Yud, and then the vowel for which is, if I remember correctly, it's 2 dots, like looking like an English colon, if I remember correctly. Yeah, and then you have Yud, He, Vav, He. So it's essentially in English it would be like YHVH. So Y would be the Y, and then the He would be like an H, and then the vowel there would be a dot, which would be O, Y, Ho, and then you have the V, the Vav, which would be a V sound. I disagree with the whole movement in academia where it's supposed to be a W. I don't. There is no W sound. Well, people can debate about that, but personally, I think it was not a W sound. It was a vav with a V sound. But anyway, um, Yeho, and then the V sound for the vav, um, all, not ah, but all. The Hebrew vowels are arranged, as I remember. I think there are, I think, three columns and one column, and three columns and several different types of vowels or vowel sounds, and one column has that its version of that sound as a short, and then another vowel has it's the same thing, only it's a longer sound. Maybe there are only two columns. A short, I think it actually come to think, I think it's a short, a column of short version of the sounds and another column of the long version of the sounds. And anyway, this vowel is not ah, it's all. So the correct pronunciation, as I suspect, is Yehovah. Anyway, um, so as I said before, Nehemiah Gordon has identified lots and lots. I'm wanting to say thousands, but I'll just say lots and lots of examples where the vowels were actually written in. Trying to remember. Oh, okay. So going back to the 10 and then the so forth. So when the translator of the Bible, a translator of the Bible, sees Yehovah or Yud He Vav He in the Hebrew, traditionally or typically, he would write it, translate in as the Lord, which is very different from Yehovah. Weird, but anyway, other times when you see Elohim, that's typically written or written in the English translation or the Greek translation, whatever, as God, which kind of destroys the whole significant meaning of Yud He Vav He and Elohim. And there's a whole other topic that I've talked about before. It's called the Woven Torah. You can go to the website chaver.com. I believe it's .com or .org. Chaver.com. The Woven Torah, and his book that you can read online. Moshe Klein talks about the significant dualism in some sense between the two names, and it's one entity, but it's like there are two aspects of this entity, and it's a lot more fascinating than simply saying that the Jews had two different gods, or at least what the documentary hypothesis proposed was that these were two different cultures writing and using different terms for their god and so forth. This is a lot more interesting because it's the idea is that it's one divine entity, but there are two different aspects of the entity. Anyway, and it also talks about Eve and her role, which has been underplayed in modern recognition of the Bible. It's fascinating. And then he proposes a visual representation for each map that the units, the verses, can be placed with the clues that the repetitious phraseology within the text itself help clue you in on how to arrange the books pictographically so it forms it forms this. And I'll get into that I've already gotten into that in earlier videos. But anyway, you have a lineage, you have Adam to Noah, that's 10, and then from Shem to Terah, which would be 9, so that'd be 19. I think it's Septuagint, or there's some tradition that adds in a 10th character. I think he's Canaan. Adds in a 10th character in that second set after the flood. so which would make it 20 total. But I'll just go with the 19. That's in the Masoretic, commonly accepted Masoretic version. So the 20th generational character beneath that is Abram, and he has an encounter with Elohim. Elohim says you will be a father of many nations, and that's how he gets the hey added into the middle of his name. So he changes from Avram, which means exalted father. It's Av meaning father and Ram meaning exalted or high, something like that. Into Avraham, and I guess Raham. I know in Hebrew, Rechem, if I remember correctly, means like a multitude. So I guess that's where you get Avraham, which would be a father of many nations. So then after that, his son is Isaac, and then Isaac begets Jacob, and then Jacob begets 12 sons, and those sons are the progenitors of the 12 tribes. And one of those sons is Judah, which is where you get the term Jew from. The Jews directly come from Judah. And another son is Levi. People say Levi. It's mispronunciation. It's Levi, which literally means is the letter Lamed. It's spelled as Lamed Vav, which means to him. And I assume that's a reference to the fact that this was the priestly class whose role was towards Yud He Vav He, to him. That's my guess. I mean, it seems pretty obvious. Okay. So Levi then begets somebody who then begets Amram, who's the father of Moses. And Moses is the 26th, I'll just call generation, instead of generational counter, you know what I mean, the 26th generation. So Adam is the first generation, goes down. Now, here's the fascinating part. Jeremy Northcote, here, I've got to get my notes on this, but while I'm looking this up, let me describe what it is. Jeremy Northcote discovered this, and so did a few others. Well, rather than go through that, okay, let's go back to that. It adds that the numbers are symbolic, and if you look at the numbers, they're so, first of all, they're so extraordinary that there's got to be some symbolism to this. I don't believe that they just made up numbers willy-nilly in terms of the ages. Enoch, first of all, is the 7th character down in the list, and he's the one that doesn't die. It says that, typically there's a formula. Each, in the text, it says each character lived a certain number of years and then begat a child, and then after begetting that child, lived another so many years and then died. Well, for Enoch, who's the 7th one down, it just says that at age 65, he begat Methuselah, and then lived another 300 years. Again, these ages are very long and high. Seemingly inflated numbers for these ages. And then what would be 365 years? He walked with the Elohim. Now, people speculate, what does that mean? It's interesting that he's in the 7th generation. Now, there was a parallel generation. In the text, it says that Adam had Eve, and the two of them created children, obviously. Eve beget Cain and Abel, and Eve says, I will name this child Cain because I've acquired, and that's a play on words on the name Cain, which means acquire. I've acquired a man-child from Yud He Vav He. You won't, okay, keep in mind, this will slip by you. if you're reading the English translation. You're reading the Hebrew. Eve, her name is actually Hava, which means living, or reference to life. And Adam refers to clay or blood. Edom means red. Edom means blood. Edom would be red, and Adam would be like clay. So it's like the physicality, and Hava meaning living or life. It's kind of an intangible essence. So it's beautiful, beautiful imagery here. So I'll just name her Eve. So Eve says, I have acquired or caned this man-child from Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. I will name him Cain. And then, of course, Cain kills Abel. I won't say murders because there was no murder at that point. He just takes his anger out on Abel. Abel dies. And so there's an interesting story there where he's doomed to wander the wilderness, or doomed to wander as a nomad. And he says, well, what if it's interesting that he asks Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, what if somebody comes upon me and kills me because of what I'd done to Abel? And so Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh makes a mark, I think it's directly on his forehead, but makes a mark on Cain saying, whoever strikes Cain down, my vengeance will be upon him like sevenfold. So it's a sign of protection. I think people have used that phrase to mean something negative. It's actually something positive. It speaks about Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh's sense of justice. You have already been punished. I will protect you from any further punishment, essentially, by someone else. Okay, so, and I'll come to think of it, as I said that just now, it's interesting that in Judaism, killing somebody is one of those acts, one of those crimes against Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh that is thought of as being godlike. Exercising an ability to take someone's life. God, of course, is able to create life. And so that's interesting. I just thought about that you can have other crimes, you can have punishments and so forth, but Cain took the life of Abel, whether he meant to or not. And so Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh giving him this protection maybe is intentionally preventing other people from acting godlike and trying to kill him. You can only answer to God for having taken someone's life. So that's interesting. Anyway, so he wanders as a nomad. And so, right, so remember, he was named Cain by Eve because she said, I have acquired a man-child from Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Then she begets another child named Seth, I believe, which means seed, or relates to seed. She says, I will name him Seth because I have begotten a seed, or I've gotten a seed from Elohim. Two different names. So you have two lineages, therefore. You have her partnering with Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh to have this child, Cain, and then afterwards she just merely gets a seed from Elohim, and that's Seth. So you have two lineages. Now in the Bible, I forget exactly what chapter, I think it's chapter 6, it mentions the lineage, there are only 7 of them, from Cain. But it ends with Tubal-Cain. And those are the ones that knew of they had special knowledge about all sorts of sciences, like making weaponry and forging metals and so forth, these special sciences. So that's in parallel to Adam, the Elohim lineage, which would be Adam, Seth, Enos. I'm using the Greek versions of them, but Adam, Seth, Enos, Mahalalel, uh, and so forth, Canaan, so forth, and so on. All right, so interestingly, in the Babylonian culture, there have been through archaeology, they've uncovered references to two lineages. Um, there was a list of kings, and then aside from the king list, there was a list of Apkallu, and these were Uannes was the first Apkallu. These were wise men who would help instruct mankind, and they were depicted as having some connection with fish. And at least one writer has likened that to mermaids and mermen and so forth. I think that's pushing it a bit, but anyway, maybe there's a little bit to it. Maybe it's been twisted quite a bit in history. So you have this Apkallu of 7, and then you have these 10 kings. Well, in the Bible, you have 10 generations alongside 7 of these other ones who were knowledgeable in special sciences. I think that's on purpose. I think that's a purposeful parallel, intentional parallel. So the final Apkallu in that 7, the seventh one, okay, let me rephrase that. You have 7 Apkallu, and the 7th one in that list is Enmenderanki, which refers to En, which should mean Lord of Lord of the connection between heaven and earth, if I remember correctly. You may have heard of the Anunnaki, by the way. Anu meaning sky or heaven, and Anu. Nu might mean the connection, and then Nak or Naki, which would mean earth. Essentially, the Anunnaki translate as connection between heaven and earth. So Enmenderanki is associated with wisdom. You also have in the Egyptian listing of the generation of deities, Thoth, who is the 7th one in a certain list, and he is credited with the hieroglyphics, inventing hieroglyphics and bestowing special knowledge. So you have that concept of the 7th one, and of course the 7 days in the week and so forth. You have that 7th generation in these cultures that refers to or characterizes, embodies special knowledge. And so it's interesting that in the Genesis list, Enoch is the 7th one. Of course, there's a book called the Book of Enoch, which heavily refers to knowledge. So then after Enoch comes the 8th generation, which would be Methuselah, and then the 9th, which is I'm blanking on his name at the moment, and then Noah, who is the 10th generation, and that's when the flood comes. So Jeremy Northcote and somebody else whose name I can't remember, several have pointed out that, of course, you have, okay, let me rephrase that. Let me start over. You have a begetting age, which would be the age when they beget a child, the next generation, and you also have a total lifespan. In other words, you add up begetting age and then the number of years after begetting, and that's the total lifespan. All right, so Jeremy Northcote and some others have noticed that if you add up from 1 to 26, all those generations, the lifespans all the way through, you get to something like 26,100. You have 26 generations. The final generation is Moses, and that's where, well, granted, it does mention that Moses has 2 children, Gershom, which which refers to, he says, I will name him Gershom because he's a stranger in a strange land, or he's residing in a strange land, something like that. Gershom, and I forget his brother's name. Um, Aside from that, the book, the fifth book in the Torah, Deuteronomy, ends with the death of Moses at age 120. Um, so if you take all those ages added together, um, you get to, I got close to 26,100. Of course, I was I was at work, and I didn't have the exact numbers with me. I was just relying on notes. Okay, that may be one thing, but here, this becomes a lot more fascinating. Okay, you move up. You get Moses. You start with Moses moving upwards, and that he's number 26. You move upwards to like whatever 20, 21, 22. That would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Um, Abraham lives to 175. Isaac lives to age 180, and Jacob lives to age 147. Now, those may seem random numbers to us, but it's been long known that they uh, they also add up to cube factors of something I'm trying to find. Let me see if I can find this in here. I don't see it there, but let me see if I get this right. It's you have three parallel number. You have three parallel columns. Abraham's age is, I have this right, 3 times 7 times 7, and then the next one is 5 times 6 times 6. No, it's 3, 5, 6. One number increases, and then the other numbers are squared. But it's like 7. Let me look through. Bear with me. You have this grouping of 3, and then Joseph is his age of 110 is the equivalent of each of these numbers, squared, added together. Let me see if I can get to that. Oh, I discovered something here. Yeah, I didn't mention. I'll mention that in terms of Christianity, that there are 4 different gospels. Why are there 4 different gospels? Each one, well, I'll just mention it here just in case I forget later on. All right, so jumping over to the Christian Bible for a moment, you have Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. People have pointed out that Mark was speaking, or we don't know who actually wrote Mark, but the book known as Mark was specifically writing towards the Romans. Christ as servant of God, submitting himself to the will of the Father. It's a different depiction. That's a different agenda, so to speak, than in Matthew. What's in Matthew? The writer of Matthew is speaking towards the Jews and characterizing Jesus as the son of David, the Messiah. The Messiah, son of David, which is different from the writer of Luke, who's writing to the Greeks. Happiness in pursuit of truth, son of man, fully human, traces his ancestry back to Adam. In other words, being part of a human man, humanity and mankind. And finally, have John. That audience seems to be everyone. Jesus is depicted as the Son of God, fully divine, creator of all things. So when you see it in that context, it's not a matter of trying to interlink all 4 gospels together and create a one large biography or something. They can't, because in some instances they're very blatant discrepancies. Like they will not jive together. One says one thing, another says another thing. I know, for example, there's there's a discrepancy as to what Jesus' final words were. Um, and there's certain things mentioned one place that are not mentioned in another place. It's because it's not just that the writers chose not to write those in, it's because they were speaking to different audiences. If you see it as more as propaganda to certain groups of people, then you understand it better. Like, I just off the top of my head, I would expect, and I did read through, I know it's, people say that Mark was likely the first one written, and then Matthew copied Mark and so forth. Um, Matthew is the one here suggested as being written directly for the Jews. Um, I would expect there to be references in Matthew about Passover and Jewish customs and so forth. Um, it would not make sense for Luke to write about those things in his gospel because this gospel, the Luke gospel, was aimed at the Greeks, and the Greeks wouldn't really care about Jewish customs or rituals and so forth. So there are different propaganda pieces, one for each audience, targeted for that specific audience, and that plays into the letters that Paul's letters to the Thessalonians and Galatians and so forth. They're writing to different audiences. All right, so going back to the numbers, I wish I could actually here. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. Come to think of it, I remember this. Right, so here is my actual thing I copied out. Okay, you see Adam, Seth, Enos, Mahalalel, and so forth, down to 10, and then 11, you see Shem, and you see over the side, let me see if I can, how well I can do this, there, you see that number there, then that number up there. Well, what I'm talking about here, and this is all the lifespan column. What I'm talking about is right here, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Levi below that. That's the equivalent, the age. Abram lives to, now ignore the 100. That's the, no, wait a minute. Ignore that 100 over there. That's simply the begetting age that I started doing. But I'm concentrating on the lifespan age. So Abram lives to 175, Isaac lives to 180, and Jacob lives to 147. Notice the formula. It's 7 times 5 times 5, and then the next Isaac is 5 times 6 times 6, and the next one, Jacob, is 3 times 7 times 7, adds up to 502. But notice the pattern. The ones that would be cubed are 5, 6, 7, and the ones that aren't cubed, the extra multipliers there are 7, 5, 3. They're each decreasing by one left out number. So we don't see 6, we don't see 4, 7, 5, 3. So, and then the 110, if I remember correctly, is 5 squared plus 6 squared plus 7 squared. And that's the age, 110, that's the age of both Joseph and Joshua, who takes over after Moses. Okay, now we get into even more interesting. Now this is more of the Jeremy Northcote, so forth stuff. Notice up here, now at the bottom it has to total, now there's 120 years old, that's for Moses. Notice there it has to total, oh, I was off, 12,600 years, which is 1260 times 10. And what I was reading, the research I was reading, talked about 1260 being associated with the end of a cycle, or apocryphal terms, so forth. I'll have to delve into that further. Okay, so up there, you see after Enoch, he walks with the Elohim. At that point, at that point, though the total of those lifespans equals 7 times 7 times 120 minus 1. And then there are 3 generations after that. If you add up those lifespans, that adds up, that total is equivalent of 7 times 7 times 120 minus 13. There's a reference in, is it in around the time of Enoch? There's a reference before the flood where see either Yud Hey Vav, I think it's Yud Hey Vav Hey, not Elohim, one or the other, who says something like the mind of the atom is evil or destructive continually. My spirit will not reside in man forever. Something like I will make his lifespan 120. And that may be a reference, notice here, to 120 being multiplied into that formula. And that's right after Enoch, which would be leading up to the flood. So that might be, that phrase might be a hidden reference to what's going on here. And 13 is could be a symbolic number. For whatever reason, 13 shows up here. Now I'll have to, again, see, I was using the math down here to prove whether, to prove whether he's right, whether this theory holds water or not. But I think that's interesting. And I've always been wondering why those numbers. Now, there's more than one version of that text, that bit of text. There's the Masoretic, there's the Septuagint. There are 2 versions of the Septuagint. I forget. There's a Codex Vaticanus and Codex something or other else, L something or other. And then there's a 3rd version. And then Josephus writes about this too, and he uses certain numbers following along. I forget which one he seems to match. His version of the numbers seems to match with. Like he's like borrowing his numbers from one of those other sources. I forget which one. But anyway, you've got basically the Masoretic. You've got 2 versions of the Septuagint, and you've got the Samaritan version. And this one, the Masoretic, is the one that if you go to a Jewish Bible, you read it, those are the numbers. The Septuagint has different numbers, and the Samaritan one has different numbers. Now, from what I've read, it seems like I can describe the difference, but right off the bat, I'll tell you that it seems to be that the Masoretic was the first, the original one, and even that was changed a little bit. Like, for example, it may be that Methuselah's total age was not 777, it was 753, and somebody changed it to 777, like a triple seven, 7 being a symbolic number for completion, maybe triple completion or something like that. But you have, so you have a year of the flood, which you can calculate, like Bishop Ussher did. You can calculate when the flood occurred based on adding up the ages of every begettings. In other words, you start off with Adam, that's 0 or year 1 or whatever, and then at age 130, he has a child, and then Seth, and then you take Seth's age when he begat, and you add those together, and that would be the year in which, from Adam's creation, when that 3rd child was. You probably get the idea. Well, if you add up all the begetting ages, and then add 100 years, because Noah experienced the flood in his 600th year of life, and he had children about 100 years earlier, so forth. But you can calculate by totaling up the ages when the flood occurred, and if I remember correctly, that's 1,656 years since Adam's creation. Um, okay, then you also have the lifespans. Well, the Septuagint, somebody played with the numbers. I'm thinking the Masoretic was the original one. I believe it's the Septuagint, not the Samaritan one. Um, yeah, Septuagint. The flood occurs later in the year, like 2207, um, and merely added added a century to the begetting age. So in the Masoretic, Adam, for example, lives 130 years and then begets Seth, whereas in this other version, he lives 230 years and then begets Seth. Somebody was adding a century to those other numbers, with exception of certain ones, and those characters are right around the time of the flood, suspiciously, as if it was starting to shorten, trying to shorten it. Um, Nobody apparently caught this, or maybe it was too late, but in that other version, the flood was supposed to kill off everybody except Noah and his wife and the three sons and their wives in the ark. Okay, look at Methuselah's age. He apparently lived beyond the year of the flood. Whoops. So that's a clue right there that whoever was inflating those years and inflating Methuselah's age and so forth wasn't paying attention to the timeline of when the flood began, and just didn't bother to change anything else, or felt he or she couldn't change anything else. So that's a very telling sign. So let me see, what else can I talk? I've been talking for quite a long time, but I hope you get some sense of where I am in terms of researching all this. I should mention that the numbers drastically drop. After Noah, they drop down to like 137, I think 200 ages of like 200 years, as opposed to like 500 years or 800 years earlier on before the flood. That's probably intentional. So that's where I am. I'll give you an update later on in another video. I want to talk about the space warp just a little bit. Okay, this is fun. Star Trek, of course, came out in 1966, and very little is mentioned in that show about how the engines of the Starship Enterprise enable it to travel to other planets quickly enough so that Kirk and his crew can be able to visit, go from planet to planet, star system to star system, like a ship would on the Earth's oceans. Go around the world and travel different places. There's a reference to a space warp. Now, okay, so in 1994, a Star Trek fan who also happened to be a theoretical physicist was speculating, after watching an episode of Star Trek, how would this really work? Could I describe it by math? Like, could I really write this out? And he figured out, all right, if you picture this as an object, and there's space-time around it. I'll have to describe, okay, let me backtrack and talk about general relativity and special relativity. You probably know that Einstein developed the theory of relativity. He first came out with special relativity, which is probably called relativity or something like that. And then he came out later, that was like 1905, and then something like 1916 or 1915, I think it was 1915, he came out with general relativity. Interestingly, he won the Nobel Prize not for this, but for, if I remember correctly, the photoelectric effect. It's been a long time since I read this, but I know he didn't get it. Ironically, he didn't get that based on relativity theory. He got the Nobel Prize from, I think, the photoelectric effect. Okay, that's another story. Uh, okay, so special relativity deals with light itself, the speed of light, or the speed, a constant. Before that, you had people thinking that um, you could simply, that there was an ether, and you could travel just quickly. You could gain, if you gained fast enough speed, you could travel anywhere you wanted. But for certain reasons, Einstein, well, Einstein actually was sailing on it. He liked to go sailing, and he imagined himself sailing and racing against a light beam, and he was trying to imagine what it would look like to race against the light beam and maybe outrace the light beam. And so, for certain reasons, I'm not remembering right now. He decided to hold something at a certain speed of a constant, and you can't go. Nothing can go faster than that constant. That's the E equals mc squared. It literally means energy equals the mass of an object multiplied by this constant squared. Um, it also means that you can rearrange the numbers too. You could have mass equals and then constant over E, or however it works out. But nothing can go faster than light. However, in Star Trek, that would work under a different principle. Thankfully, Einstein came up with general relativity. Relativity explains how time and if time is a constant, you can't go faster than the speed of light. Then time, no, I shouldn't have said constant. Time is like a limiting factor, and space time is like a fabric. If you warp the fabric, you're not going faster than light. You're bending the fabric that the object is traveling through. So in terms of Star Trek, there's space, and this is what Miguel Alcubierre, the physicist, was proposing in his paper. You have a space time, and you have the Enterprise traveling through the space time. Imagine a rug. Well, you can't imagine. You can't. There's a limit to how fast you can get the object to move over the rug. Okay, that's special relativity. You can't go faster than light. However, you can take the rug and you can curl it up. You can curl it so that around, on either side, you can curl it so the ship doesn't have to travel all that distance. All that distance has now been curled up. It just has to move slightly forward and skip all that travel in between. So that's what he called contraction. So if you have the ship and you here, I'll take here, it's a crude thing, but okay, imagine this is the Enterprise. I know I have the Enterprise, some toy Enterprise somewhere, but it's traveling along. It dumps out its cargo or whatever. Here, it's traveling along. Picture all this is contractible. You warp, and this is what happens with black holes in real life. You bend the medium that this is traveling through. Like, imagine if this is in water, in a swimming pool, and you could somehow take the water and bend it into another in another dimension. It bends so that this doesn't have to travel the entire length of that water that has subsequently been bent in another dimension. It can just simply skip it and float through. It's kind of awkward because I've been thinking about this. Like in college, I would think of this. In college, I spent a lot of my extra time doing a lot of extra studies and interests and outside reading, and I wondered, how could you go through? How could the bent part of space-time be bent, I mean, in another dimension, and you'd still, if you're traveling through our dimensions, I don't see how you could be traveling through our three dimensions and be able to make it to the other side if part of that is bent. It's hard to describe. I hope you get what I'm saying. Alongside, this is bent, like it has to travel from here, has to travel from here to here. But if you bend this, it just has to travel from here to here. However, how does it make that jump from one to the other? I know it's nice. It doesn't have to go all the way around, travel that distance that I have bent. Um, However, how does it make it from here to here? That puzzled me. Anyway, Miguel Alcubierre wrote this paper, including math and so forth, figuring that if you contract the space in front of the ship and expand the space-time in behind the ship or around the ship in a certain way, you can propel the ship would naturally seem to move forward, and then you contracting the space. It's like a surfer on a wave, a water wave. You're contracting the space time in front, now therefore bringing the ship closer. You're shortening the distance between the ship and another planet in front of it. And while it's doing that, it's expanding the space-time, the amount of the length of space behind the ship. So you're just moving the ship forward. I hope you get my drift with that. So playing with space-time, so that therefore requires a lot of energy. And so he called this. I think he was the one. He or later physicists called it, and this was 1994 when I think the paper came out, but they called it exotic matter. It's also negative energy density. It's an exotic matter exotic meaning we don't find it commonly, and it would have to be a matter that has negative energy density. All our matter seems to have positive energy density. In other words, the density, the density of the matter that we recognize is positive. How do you get it negative? In other words, positive energy density or positive mass, the gravity acts one way towards it. It moves positively towards. Right. It moves positively towards the mass. The mass causes like with black holes, the mass generates a positive gravity so that things fall towards it. But negative energy density would mean things would fall away from it. And so this negative energy density, or this exotic matter, has been proposed as a way also to keep wormholes open. A wormhole and a black hole are essentially the same thing. A black hole is, I like that idea of a rubber sheet. Imagine a rubber sheet. You have a ball, or bowling ball. This is a very common allegory to it, or analogy to it. You have a heavy bowling ball. The heavier the bowling ball is, the more it's going to sink into this rubber sheet, and you see that sagging. It's going right into the sheet, and you see it bulge underneath. Well, that bulge would be in another dimension. You have our three dimensions. It's not necessarily up, down, whatever. They're just orthogonal dimensions at right angles to each other. Well, if you imagine another dimension on top of that, this gravity would be warping, maybe the fourth dimension. This gravity would be causing the bowling ball to warp the space-time rubber sheet into another dimension. Um, so the same way with a mass, a very dense, heavy mass like a star. Not every star can, when it implode, when it shrinks, when it implodes, would become a black hole. You have to have a certain amount of mass. Um, or when it does, it stretches the space time. There's so much gravity. Picture that rubber sheet. There's so much tug that if a marble were to go anywhere close, if it gets close enough, it would reach the event horizon, which would mean there's not enough strength to go back out. It has to slide and fall right into that sagging spot where the in that extra dimension where or that other dimension where the bowling ball sags into the rubber sheet. And the event horizon is that zone around the mass that's generating the black hole, or that the mass that caused the black hole. It's that zone within which you wouldn't be able to have enough speed, enough strength to be able to withstand the forces that are tugging in, concentrating it. And it's concentrating it into something called a singularity. And beyond that, of course, you have some reasonable means of being able to escape it. It's like a tractor beam. Once you're caught in the tractor beam, there's no getting out. And physicists have described what it would be like in such a black hole environment. First of all, this is fascinating. If you were doing an animation of this, your body would, like, apparently from the outside point of view, your body would stretch and stretch and stretch. Time would slow. I think you yourself, if you were falling in, you would experience time normally, but all the other observers would see you as slowing and slowing until you just freeze. Because I believe, if I remember correctly, the light emanating out from you, sending images of you, couldn't be able to escape this event horizon. It would stay trapped. So at some point, outside observers would just see you blink out of existence. You would freeze, and then you just blink out because they couldn't be able to see the light messages. Photons won't be able to reach the observer anymore to show them what you look like. So you have to have a large enough mass. I don't know if Saturn. There are calculations to figure out, like for example, Saturn being very large or the Sun being very large, Jupiter, if it were to be squished into like a black hole type scenario, how its event horizon would, how wide its event horizon would be. And they're small, but it is possible to get something out of that. So anyway, somebody calculated it would take something like the equivalent of 8 suns to be able to start bending space-time, which is something really extraordinary. Hopefully, maybe we can figure out some way of doing it. That's when you get to 1999, and it was Chris Van Broek and other physicists have come along and looked at Miguel Alcubierre's math and his paper and figured, oh, we can do it we can do it better. We can get closer to more realistic dimensions and realistic required amounts of mass to be able to bend space-time. And it's been at least a decade and a half since I've read about this stuff. So I won't venture into talking about this any further, but I hope I've given you the gist of it, like a preparation. So if I talk about it in a future video, you're ready. So I guess I've talked quite a bit, and I don't know what I'll be talking about next week, but how do you like this more informal presentation? I didn't put in the time to edit in the opening credits and everything, I'm taking cue from this classmate of mine from earlier elementary school. He said that I should be spreading my knowledge and just talking about what I like to talk about. So maybe that works better for you. Okay, so I'll talk to you next time. Bye.